Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History podcast. And today I'm joined by James Valliant and Dr. Stephen Boyce. And today's topic is going to be about, do we need Paul's epistles to know and or ascertain a historical Jesus? Do we really need the letters? Does it all hinge upon the epistles to believe that there was a historical Jesus? So that's what tonight's discussion is going to be about. I'll have the link to Jim's website in the description below and to Dr. Stephen Boyce's YouTube channel, which is tagged in the description below. The links will also be in the pinned comment below as well. And that being said, Jim and Stephen, thank you both for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, good to be back.
Yeah, so Stephen, you have a presentation that you prepared that you'll be sharing your screen pretty soon here. But just to explain the topic a little bit more to the audience, in case it's not quite clicked in yet, is what we're going to be discussing tonight is, do we need the Pauline epistles to know or not if there was a historical Jesus? So basically, the discussion is like I wanted to have a discussion in which we can focus more on other texts and not being restrained to only the letters, because some discussions about if there was a Jesus or not and debates like that, what bothers me about those discussions is they tend to be locked in to the Pauline epistles, and should they be locked in to only the Pauline epistles? So with that being said, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it comes down to three separate answers based on three separate groups. If you only believe there are 7, and now there's a push for 6, the Pauline letters, well, then you're only going to have those to be valid arguments for Jesus. And then you can even, like Dr. Carrier and others, go into those very texts and explain away the references like Galatians 1 and 1 Corinthians 15, etc. So you can go through that, and that one crowd says everything is hinging on that. Then you have another crowd that's a part of that says, well, we actually can look at the Gospels as well, even if you accept them as later dates. The earliest being, some people would say the earliest is Mark at 70 AD, 70, 72. And then these others that come later in the end of the 1st century into the early 2nd century, they still count as texts that represent a person, Jesus of Nazareth. And so some people can live with that. They can say, well, we don't just have Paul. We just don't have these other texts with it. We can add the Gospels. The Gospels count as well. Then you have a third crowd that comes in this and says, it really doesn't matter if you accept only Paul or some of the Gospels or one of the Gospel accounts or none of the Gospel accounts. There's a accumulation of statements made within Christianity, within Judaism, within the Roman government, enough to corroborate a statement that could be made that there was a physical Jesus of Nazareth that existed with Paul, without Paul. So it really depends where you're coming at it, because all of these discussions, especially in the New Testament, even if you don't accept the other Pauline letters, most of which some still hold are late 1st century, or the Gospels could be held as late 1st century. There's still 1st century texts describing a certain person in a certain plot of land around a certain group of people who did certain things. And so you could still walk away with a historical Jesus, even if you don't accept the validity of some of these texts, even if you don't accept the pseudo-Pauline, as some call them, or the Gospels as eyewitnesses. You still have enough within the 1st century going into the 2nd century that you can corroborate some level of evidence for a person named Jesus of Nazareth. So it really comes down to, where do you start your argument? Do you believe these? Do you believe these? Do you hold all of them? Do you hold partial truth, some truth, a lot of truth, or no truth at all? It really is a matter of where somebody starts their argument.
And one thing I wanted to bring up real quick is, even if we didn't have all these other texts that talk about a crucified man called Jesus, let's just imagine real quick that what if scenario. What if things turned out differently and we had no evidence except for that one little mention of Jesus, or Christus, by Tacitus in his annals? And if that were all we had, to me, that would still be enough for me to think, okay, there was a crucified guy under Pilate. Because now some people say that's an interpolation. I don't buy that, especially with kind of things it says in there. I just don't see how that makes any sense. I don't even think that Josephus was interpolated in the Testimonium. And I look at these other texts and I was like, okay, I think that kind of is evidence of a historical Jesus. And Josephus, some people say, well, he could have gotten that from other Christians. Now, he did mention Christians in the Testimonium, so maybe he did, but I don't think that invalidates the evidence that Josephus presents us either. So I just want to say that real quick.
Well, do you want me to pull up the statement from Tacitus, and then
Please
Jim,
do.
you
Yes.
jump in? Jim makes some kind. I know Jim wants to say something because we can actually show exactly what we're talking about here. If I'm allowed to share my screen, we'll do that.
Yeah.
Do you have
Sure,
it set up
bless
where I
you.
can do that?
I think
It's not,
Yeah, sweet.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I just think I have to agree with Jacob about our non-Christian texts. That is to say, by at least the time of Pliny the Younger's correspondence with Trajan, we've got a Christian movement that he's attesting to having existed by the late 1st century. And Tacitus, of course, specifically refers to, the Jesus movement getting the blame under Nero for the Great Fire of 64. And I hope we have that text. And of course, even if Josephus, the Testimonium, has been tampered with, I'm confident there was a reference to Jesus in Josephus. And we have no doubt. I mean, is everything an interpolation, by the way? It really becomes straining for me with mythicists because, this has to be interpolated, this has to be interpolated, this has to be interpolated. Why? So we can stand on our heads to dismiss at least the core fact that there was a Jesus who was crucified under Pilate. And I think that it would be hard to explain the tradition generally, even if we didn't have the Pauline letters, whatever you regard as the genuine Pauline letters. We have enough tradition in the Gospels combined with, and other Christian literature, by the way. I don't restrict myself to the 1st century even.
Sure.
And Tacitus certainly isn't 1st century. But the point is that there's a Jesus movement, and there appears to be differences within the Jesus movement. And that would be very hard for me to explain. And we do seem to have a core fact that Jesus was crucified under Pilate, attested to in Jewish, Christian, and pagan Roman source material from the 1st century and a half. So I'm with or without the Pauline corpus, or whatever you think of the Pauline corpus, I think I would still be, if that's the question before the court, I think I would still be a historicist about the fact of a crucifixion of a guy named Jesus under Pilate, if that makes sense.
And it's fair to note what Jim was just saying, that there were even different sects or groups that followed in Christianity that differed from each other, including not just in theological practice, but even in written traditions. For example, I just released this weekend a translation that I did of the Gospel of Peter 5 years ago, February of 2020. I did it when I was doing my PhD. It's now released. It's on my academia page. Anybody can go download it now. I made it public. It was public for a while on a website that's no longer around. But what do we see in the Gospel of Peter? We see it pick up in the fragment, because all we have is almost the very end, and then it cuts off even on the last page or pages. And it starts with the trial. And it deals with Herod, and it deals with Pontius Pilate. It deals with Joseph of Arimathea. It deals with centurions guarding the tomb. It deals with a man being crucified. It deals with thieves being crucified next to him. It deals with a man being buried. It deals with a man being resurrected. It deals with a man who is being talked about in a way where he had these followers, disciples, and it's trying to sell you that it's Peter, of course, because at the very end of the fragment where it cuts off, it says, I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew, and then blank, 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 it cuts off. And so he's even trying to sell you, even talks about women going to the tomb. It talks about the Jewish leaders trying to figure out how to sell the story, just as we see in like Matthew or in one of the synoptics. So we have other traditions in addition to Paul that speak of this physical person. And that text is coming from a different sect. It doesn't seem to be a part of the Orthodox teaching or even some of the earlier apostolic groups. It seems to be something outside of the group, enough to where some of the people in the apostolic group like, it's got some inaccuracies in it, maybe some docetism here, but in the end, it's accurate in places. That's the best compliment it can get. The rest of everybody else is completely rejected to the point where it's not even transcribed anymore and given all the way down to the tradition, to where all we have is a fragment that is found in a tomb with a dead monk. I mean, that's the only evidence of it that even survives. So when you're talking about other texts, like Jim was just saying, this is true that we do have other traditions that even demonstrate this in addition. But that brings us to people like Tacitus, for example. Who is Tacitus? And he's a part of Roman government. I mean, he's not an outsider. He's not just a guy with an opinion. They didn't have social media to share their feelings on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. I mean, this guy was a part of very important discussions. He had access to the archives of Roman documents. And when he speaks of this Christus, he's not saying it in relation to the Christian communities, or that I heard it from the Christian communities. I debated Dr. Carrier on the historicity of Jesus. I think it's been 2 or 3 years now. These are one of the discussions he and I have had in personal correspondence, and as well briefly in the public debate. One of the things that we look at is the accusation is that Tacitus had received this information from rumors of Christian communication. The problem with that is he's not speaking to Christians or necessarily about them, although he is involving them. But the mentioning of where this information happened is coming from Roman documents. Note that the quote I have on here, and Jim alluded to it a little bit. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations. That is talking about the Christians there. Then he speaks specifically on Christus, from which the name had its origin. And it's, notice this, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our leaders, right? Notice how he's speaking from a Roman perspective. And then he lists him, Pontius Pilate. And the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for their moment, again broke out not only in Judea, first source of evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. He's saying this began with a person. As we know, Tiberius and his reign under Pontius Pilate put him to death, not just to death, but he speaks of a type of death that is the extreme penalty. Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what penalty that was. I don't think even anybody on this panel would disagree that this is talking about a Roman crucifixion. But when we look at Tacitus, he doesn't give us any indication that he got this information from the rumor mill. He's speaking of our leader, of our governor, Pontius Pilate. He's speaking of somebody as a part of the Roman province and our city and our leaders. He's not speaking from rumor. He's speaking from somebody who had understanding of court decisions that were made in relation to where the Christians came from and how Nero later treated them. So, Jim, there's one of the quotes from Tacitus. I'm assuming you're alluding to this one as well. I'm just curious your thoughts on the relation to Tacitus and his statement, where he would have originally gotten this information from to begin with.
Well, he doesn't seem to have a very high opinion of Christians, so
He doesn't.
I wouldn't have that much confidence that he got the story from Christians. Why, if it were merely a Christian source, why would he have such a negative opinion? If he had such a negative opinion, why would he rely exclusively on Christian sectarian sources? As you point out, he's a Roman senator. He appears, and we have some idea, he does indicate himself in other places what his various sources are. Other Roman historians, Roman records, and so forth. And I think you have to be correct. I think that for this to make any sense, unless there is no indication to me that this is an interpolation, it would seem to me that what we have here is a report from a pagan Roman senator that is not reliant on Christians, a group of people that I don't think he would trust if they were his exclusive source.
No, and I agree with that, because if we're looking at this from his perspective, he's not the only one around this time complaining about the problem of Christianity, which we'll get to another quote in a minute. If he was independent, and Jacob, you brought this up a minute ago, if all we had was Tacitus, you would still believe it. I think you're right in that regard, but I like corroborating the evidence. I like looking at an accumulative case of statements. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I mean, I think that if this was an independent statement on its own, we have no reason to deny it, because we see in Tacitus other independent claims
Right.
that are not denied by anybody, to my knowledge. Maybe we could say they're not corroborated, or we could say that they're not a part of other attestation. But Tacitus makes remarks all the time that we can't put together with anybody else's statement. And we don't sit there and go, this is just myth and it's made up. And somebody just came behind him and interpolated it. If every independent claim is interpolated, then we have nothing. We lose so much of history. Sometimes a single person preserves a single truth without even corroboration. We may not have that confidence in it that we'd like to have. But another thing that you'd have to look at in this as well is, like, do we see something here linguistically or syntactically in Tacitus that is just so weird, just out of place? It seems like there's construct of wording being put together and then going back to normality, or it's like, here's normal Tacitus. Whoa, where did that come from? That doesn't sound, feel, or anything like his wording. All of a sudden, he's using language we've never seen before in any of his writings. Do we see that in this section? Not really. I mean, there's nothing unique here other than the statement of Christus. But that makes sense, given he uses not Jesus's name in regard to his Jewish name, but rather his descriptive name. Christus just means Messiah, the Messiah being the chosen one or the anointed one. He's using the play on of the word Christian comes from Christus, and he's doing it in a Latinized form. Right. So clearly that's all he's going for here. He's trying to put the connection together. These people are derived from this leader that our government put to death under Tiberius, under the governance of Pontius Pilate. And that's where they got their name. And he's basically saying they're hideous and shameful, just like their Jesus guy was, or their Christus guy was. He's not speaking highly of Christus. He's saying the guy was an embarrassment. He was put under extreme penalty during this time. It's not he's not like, man, a couple thousand years from now, people are going to really deny if this guy existed, so let me make a shout out to him. He's not speaking positively of either group. He's actually speaking negatively of both.
Yeah, if this is a Christian interpolation, they sure missed an opportunity to give a plug to Jesus. Rather, they're preserving or creating what was mostly a negative reference, which would be astonishing. More than that, it fits very well within his narrative about 64 AD and indeed the Great Fire. We need an explanation for his explanation of Nero, and this seems to fit the bill. It seems to fit nicely. There doesn't seem to be, like you point out, anything that jumps out as later language or later ideas or anything pro-Christian, which would be the sort of things that would signal an interpolation by later Christians. And as I say, just looking at the face of it, there may have been a variety of opinions among Romans about Christians, but Tacitus has a negative opinion and of this movement. It's an abominable thing that came to Rome, like all bad things, end up in Rome. So
what I like to say real fast is
Christian interpolation, isn't it?
What I like to say real fast is that, and I mentioned this recently in a separate video, I said, I don't like arguments of interpolation. It's extremely subjective. And what one person may see as a problem, another one will not see it. It's a mess. And like, for instance, the testimonium is actually, I think, a perfect example of this problem. A while back, a lot of scholars said the testimonium was interpolated more than a century ago. And then later, all of a sudden, they don't have a problem with it, or they don't have a problem with most of it. And the more I'm looking at scholarship today, it's actually moving towards the direction that the whole thing might be fine the way it is, or almost the whole thing might be fine the way it is. And the point that I'm making is that if a lot of people can get the testimonium being interpolated wrong like that, and the issue is there's no manuscript evidence, it's missing from Josephus. Now, yes, later Christian sources post-Eusebius may quote it differently, but it's still there. There's no manuscript that we have of Josephus. I know the manuscripts are late, but there's no manuscript of Josephus where it's missing.
Right.
I would prefer to have something missing before we start arguing it was added. Because you can't really know for sure if it was added or not. It's a guessing game, a very unreliable guessing game.
Yeah, see, I see no reason to doubt the James passage in the Antiquities. And I think the James passage by itself implies that there was a passage about Jesus. And whatever we make of the testimonium and the wording of the testimonium, I think that it is very probable that there was a reference to Jesus, or the James passage wouldn't make much sense. And I don't see any reason to doubt the James passage, whatever. And so I think we would have to add Josephus to our non-biblical, mind you, sources. Like he may not be a pagan, he's Jewish, he may not be a pagan like Tacitus. And then in between, we have the correspondence between Pliny the Younger, then governor of Bithynia, and the Emperor Trajan, which attests to a Christian movement about 20 years that reached its peak in Pliny's view about 20 years prior to his writing, which makes it late first century, roughly the time when Josephus is writing. So I see no reason to doubt those three sources right there. And they seem to be corroborating one another about a movement. And it's, although Pliny doesn't mention Jesus or Christ particularly, nonetheless, it seems to be cross-corroborating the existence of a Jesus movement that needs to be noticed by the late first century and early second century by a variety of sources.
Yeah, and I went ahead and skipped to one of the quotes, and that's a good point that you both have brought out. The nice thing about Josephus, he doesn't just say it once, right? So if there even was a disputed section, there's more than one statement he makes, and particularly about the brother of James. Here is one of the places in Antiquities that he mentions Jesus as a wise man. And Dr. Schmidt recently just released a lot of publication, not just his book, but he's been on a lot of programs. And one of the things that he talks about is the connections that Josephus had with the priests in Jerusalem at that time, many of which were at the trial of Jesus. And I agree with Schmidt on one of the points, that the thing that Josephus is making about Jesus in one regard, same thing with Tacitus, it's not a positive statement, some of which is critical, although he acknowledges some niceties here. But as a whole, I don't think Jesus was a positive figure in the mind of Josephus, especially his connection with the high priest, the amount of work that he did with his friends that were connected in the war and so forth. But he talks about Jesus as a wise man. He says, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Messiah. Now, there's a lot of dispute about the translation of this coming from different manuscripts and languages, which Dr. Schmidt gets into, and so do others. But what did he mean by that line right there? It seems positive in some of the English translations like this, but it probably wasn't. It was actually probably more negative. And when Pilate, as the suggestion of the principal man amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, there it is again, another statement in the first century, in the late first century into the second century, stating that there was a man named Jesus or named Christus who was put to death by a governor named Pontius Pilate. And let's be real, Pontius Pilate wasn't a popular guy. I mean, he wasn't one of the greats. You know, when you're looking at Tacitus, for example, he's actually focusing on Nero because he's trying to figure out how to deal with these people and not be a nut job like Nero. They're trying not to repeat what Nero did because Nero took a lot of criticism for what he did. So they're trying to figure out how to deal with Christians without becoming a major massacre and a lot of death, even though these people in his mind are hideous, shameful, embarrassing, and pathetic. Like, that's his mindset. How do we deal with this? And that's what Pliny's trying to do later. Like, how do we deal with these people? I've arrested a few of them. Should I kill them? I mean, what are we doing? Like, there's a lot of conversation about this. Josephus looks at this and says, look, Jesus was a person who is really admired by many Jews because of works he did. Even Gentiles came into the picture here. He was called the Messiah. Not necessarily that Josephus believed this. Again, there's translation problems here. He was called the Messiah when Pilate, at the suggestion of principal men among us, notice where Josephus puts his allegiance, particularly with religious leaders of the Jewish people, had condemned him to the cross. So there's a crucifixion. It was consistent with what we're seeing in all these other accounts. Those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again on the third day, as the divine prophets foretold these 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. The tribe of Christians, so named from him, the extent at this day. So again, Christians are named after him, similar to what Tacitus was saying. But he also gets some of his information wrong here. He talks about how people did not abandon him that were with him, which is actually not true. The gospel accounts say they all abandoned him, save a handful of people, mostly women. And so he's going off information that he has, including contradicting some of the gospel accounts in themselves and what they're saying happened. Yeah, of course, they came back around after his third day of resurrection. Now, again, there's a lot of dispute about this. There's a lot of question about how this should be translated, how some of the differences are in translation. But one thing that we can say about Josephus, as already been stated, he states this about Jesus more than once. And how you translate this is irrelevant to stating a man existed who was killed under Pontius Pilate.
Right.
So here's one of the quotes here.
Yeah, I have to say that the most persuasive arguments for the testimonium really focus on the fact that one can, although in English translation, it seems like a restatement of Christian, faith. And that is what causes a lot of people to believe it's been tampered with. In fact, there's linguistic parallels to the Emmaus narrative in Luke, and people have observed that. I'm not sure which way we should consider the influence going. But in any case, without even getting into all that, it can be read as either neutral or negative. It doesn't necessarily read as a glowing account of Christian faith. And I think if we approach it that way, we will be predisposed to say, oh, look, this thing has got to be mostly or all interpolation. But it doesn't need to be even read that way. It can be read as neutral or even negative. And that, I think, is some of the powerful new insights that are defending the authenticity of the testimony.
Right.
But whether or not it's been interpolated, let's set that aside. I do believe we have multiple references to Jesus in the work of Josephus. And as you point out, he is very much involved in Jewish politics before the war, according to his own autobiography.
Yes.
And he would have his own independent Jewish sources about the matter.
Right. And most of those were high priests or children of the high priest who were at the trial and involved. I mean, you can almost see him insinuate that even in the quote here. He says that at the suggestion of the principal men among us. Yeah. Notice what category he puts himself in because of his father, because of the relationships he had with the family of Caiaphas and Annas. He's involved in these people. I mean, he was in war with some of these people. He considers himself not team Christian, but team principled men among the Jews. He still categorically places himself here. Also, at this point, Josephus becomes a court historian. And Josephus, for him to say something like this as a representative of the histories, not necessarily in favor of the Jews, although he deals with that, but even the Romans are now involved. He would be opening himself up to criticism in both camps had he affirmed Jesus in any way, or if he made the guy up, because he would have been fact-checked not just by Romans, but by Jews, because he's accusing them of having this man put to death. And if he's accusing them of having put this man to death and he never existed, he's setting himself up for absolutely unnecessary criticism, including his buddies that he calls the prestigious or principal men among us. Why would he set himself up for that kind of criticism? And then he's claiming it was done by the Roman government under Pontius Pilate, which would now open himself up for criticism from the Romans by making this up. He would have hit a double whammy of criticism had he just made this whole entire thing up, both from the Jews, accusing them of putting a guy to death under a Roman governor who gave the final verdict to put him to death. You're setting yourself up from both camps that you're trying to exist in for unnecessary criticism. I don't think that would have been a good move for him politically in any way.
He certainly, one thing I do know is that in his own autobiography, he's proud of his own priestly background and connections.
Yes, he is.
So, and he, as you point out, among us, he's self-identifying once more as being among the leading men of the Jews in the period. And as you point out, he's also working for the Romans. And so he could be double fact checked here, as you point out, and he runs a desperate, whatever your politics or religion, he runs a desperate risk of taking flack from both ends. I think that is a fair argument as well. Whatever we think of his position, it seems to be a flat statement that could be verified by the people that he's worked with and working for, and I see no reason to doubt that we have at least two mentions of Jesus in Josephus, and here specifically executed in the reign. Once more, we're told it's in the reign of Tiberius, and it locates it just as the gospel tradition does with Pontius Pilate. So again, it seems to be a verification of the historicity of Jesus.
He also thinks that there's a lot of connections. It's almost like he's flirting with Christianity at the end here, but then completely distanced himself. He talks about how the divine prophets had foretold these kinds of events and tens of thousands of other wonderful things concerning him. He's saying he recognizes that Christians have made a huge defensive case for their Messiah. But notice how he distances himself. And the tribe of Christians, he's speaking of them externally, so named from him and are not extinct to this day. He's not identifying with them, but he's almost flirting with them. Like, well, I mean, the prophets talked about something like this and tens of thousands of wonderful things. He must have heard multiple traditions from every side. It's almost like he's saying, I've heard it all, folks. I've heard it from the Jews. I've heard it from the Christians. I've heard it from the Romans. And these people will not go extinct over this stuff. There's tens of thousands of stories about wonderful things about this guy. But then he makes darn sure to let you know he's not going to be included with them. So it's interesting how he takes that approach.
Yeah, and he has to. I mean, he is a historian, and so he has to maintain a certain. Even in those days, where historians like Tacitus or Josephus are obviously working history in a way that contemporary historians wouldn't do it. Nonetheless, he has to maintain a certain kind of third-person perspective and neutrality on it. And that seems to be what we're reading here, as you point out. He's not identifying with them. On the other hand, he's saying, yes, there were wonderful things said about him. And so it feels right. I mean, in other words, it feels like the kind of report you'd get from a late first century historian if there were a Jesus who'd been crucified under Pilate. So I have to agree, this is, at the very least, however we interpret it, it seems to be a corroboration of a historical Jesus.
Yep, I 100% agree. I've also got another one, bar-Serapion. There's a lot of dispute about the date of this. If it is the person that we think it is, it's going to be very early. However late of a one single point of evidence that we have of it, he writes a letter to his son. He talks about the Athenians. He talks about Socrates put to death. He talks about major figures being put to death. Then he comes to the Jews. He talks about how the Athenians put Socrates to death and they paid for it. Then he mentions these other figures all the way up to what we believe to be Jesus. He says, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? Now, note, this is consistent with another phrase back in Antiquities, how Josephus referred to Jesus as a wise man. So nobody's denying the wisdom of this person. And he's not saying that he was God or anything like that. I mean, although I personally believe that the claim of Jesus being divine is all through the Gospels, and I believe that it is historically defendable, but let's just take that out of the argument completely. Focus on somebody on the outside of this, just writing a casual letter to his son about, let's be careful who we turn against and kill because it might backfire kind of situation. He uses Socrates as an example. Now, Socrates, he speaks about the Athenians. He speaks about the downfall that comes from putting to death an innocent man who was a wise teacher. Then he mentions the Jews. The Jews have this wise king. It was just after their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians overwhelmed by the sea, the Jews ruined and driven out by their land, living to complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on the teaching of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teachings which he had given, which he's saying they're still around. His teachings are still around. Socrates is still around. These different teachings have continued despite killing the man. Killing the man did not stop the narrative. Killing the man did not stop the cause. He's also agreeing with what we saw in Tacitus and Josephus. These people are not extinct. They're still around. They're still carrying the name. They're still carrying the teachings. Now, there is some dispute about this letter itself, but it is another evidence that is consistent with the others that we've seen, that there was a wise teacher who claimed to be a king or was called a king of his people, and they put him to death, and he was innocent. And in putting an innocent man to death, they paid for it. Specifically, this must be post 70 AD, because he's alluding to the fact that their entire temple and their worship system was destroyed, but his teachings continued past the Jewish people's traditions who killed him. So this is an interesting perspective as well.
That is interesting. I can't make any claims about the date or its sources here in this instance, though. I'm afraid I'll have to bow out and indicate that I'm in no position to argue the dating or sources of this source. On the other hand, as you point out, it does seem to fit with the kind of language that we've already seen in Tacitus and Josephus.
Yes. Let's keep going for the sake of time. In the Talmud, even though the date of this is 220 AD, but the reports of the Talmud, especially in some of these sections, is far earlier than the tradition itself. You see in the Sanhedrin 43a, there's a tradition. They hang Yeshua on the Sabbath of the Passover. But for 40 days before that, herald went in front of him crying, Yeshua is to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and seduced Israel and led them away from God. Anyone who can provide evidence on his behalf should come forward and defend him. When, however, nothing favorable about him was found, he was hanged on a Sabbath of the Passover. So here's a Jewish tradition. Yes, it's later, but it's alluding to a historic practice. Again, not a support of Jesus. These are not supporters. These are critics. They're part of the succession group that killed Jesus. And he's saying there's this person that Yeshua was hung on the Passover feast, which is consistent with the Gospels. For 40 days that herald went forth him crying, we should stone him. We see that in the Gospels, that they sought to stone him. And times the Gospels are saying they picked up stones to stone him and he slipped out of the crowd. There was an attempt to put him to death by stoning, which was a more traditional way the Jews would do things. But they wanted to find evidence. Notice the bias, like, anyone who could provide evidence on his behalf should come forward and defend him when, however, nothing favorable about him was found, which is, in their perspective, true. But they weren't willing to listen to reason anyway. They were manipulating the whole thing in the Gospels. But nobody was able to defend him, and the Gospels say that people lied about him, and then they hung him. They hung him on a tree, which is taking these Jewish leaders back to, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. But the time that this was done was during the high Sabbaths of the Passover feasts, which included the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of First Fruits, in which you resurrected. And so in these Sabbath feasts, these high feast days, and the whole Paschal feast itself, he is claiming that is when this man was put to death. But notice how the Sanhedrin was not speaking favorably again about a guy named Yeshua. It is critical. It is negative. What benefit is it for them to put in their reports this statement about a guy named Yeshua? It doesn't say anything about him being this awesome guy that raised people from the dead, healed the sick, raised little children back to life, taught good things for people to live moral lives. None of that. It's just he was accused. Nobody could defend him. There's no evidence of innocence in him. Therefore, he was put to death. He deserved to be stoned, but as a result, he was hung. What benefit is it for this group of the Sanhedrin later to make this report up, even though it's 220? It's alluding back to earlier times.
There's a couple of things I want to bring up real quick. Yeah, I've had discussions about the Talmud mentioning Jesus with other people before, and there seems to be, I think, at least somewhat of a mixed opinion on scholarship about
Of
how to
course.
deal with the Talmud's references to Jesus, because I think somewhere in the Talmud there's a suggestion that Yeshu had no Sri, Jesus of Nazarene, or Jesus, son of Pandera, was placed in an earlier period. So my question is, if could they have? Because I see what you're saying, and lately I've been thinking a little bit more. I used to think this a long time ago, and I'm kind of coming back to it, that I could see the case that there is a reference, a garbled reference to the historical Jesus in the Talmud, but could he have gotten mixed up with a different Jesus that died under Alexander Jannaeus, and they kind of mixed them up together?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I did want to state that that could be a possibility. However, it's very consistent with the gospel narratives. For example, they accused him of practicing sorcery. Do we see that kind of language in the gospels? Well, sure. He was called a person who did things in the name of Beelzebub. He was casting out demons in the name of demonic power. He was accused of not using something from God, because God would never do that. So it must be the spirit of this world, the spirit of the devil, the spirit of sorcery. That kind of accusation was put on Jesus. Another interesting point, as I made, is that there was an attempt of stoning that led to hanging, which is typical of, I mean, it doesn't mention a crucifixion. Fair enough. But what's interesting is it doesn't mention just stoning or just hanging. It's that they attempted to stone and ended up in a hanging, which is consistent with what Jesus happened. They wanted to stone him, ended up hanging him on a tree. And another thing that we see here that's unique is the timing of the death. It's not just on a Sabbath or a high Sabbath, but the high Sabbath feast, which is the Passover. Now, there are some parallels, like you stated, to a different figure, and I'll leave that door open. The question that I'm asking here is it possible? I'm not presenting this and saying it's definitive. I'm saying that there's a lot of coincidental points here. Another thing is that in his practice of sorcery, he seduced Israel. Now, that's not implying just a small crowd. There were a lot of people that rose up. Even Gamaliel spoke about this in the book of Acts, that different figures had come up and led away small schisms and so forth, and they came to nothing. This seems to be in the mind of the Sanhedrin that there was a entire national deviation and schism, because he says he seduced Israel and led them away from God, which is also what they accused Jesus of. But not just a people, not just a town, not just a city, not just a sect, not even the Hellenized people or just religious people or the poor, which Jesus is but that he took the whole nation. I don't know if that can be said of the other figure, unless I'm reading into this more than it is. And that's very, very possible. I'll be open and honest and say I could be wrong here.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm definitively right either. I'm just saying, to me, it seems too consistent.
I think that's right. That makes sense to me. I think what happened, to explain the other piece of evidence that indicates that there was a man that was executed under Alexander Jannaeus, I think they kind of they took the gospel story there and they kind of merged it, grafted it upon that guy. That's what it sounds like to me, because there's a later text that I think provides additional evidence that there was an awareness that this issue, that this mistake, whether it was deliberate or accidental, was attempted to be resolved in the extremely late first millennium AD text for Toldeth Yeshu. The Toldeth Yeshu is a very strange text. There's like two different versions of it, but it says, at least two versions that I know of, but it suggests that Jesus was executed by Alexander Jannaeus, but it puts Alexander Jannaeus in the 1st century by making Queen Helena of Adiabene, she was also the queen of Edessa, because after her first husband died, she married her second husband, and that's how that happened. She went from queen of Adiabene to queen of Edessa. But anyway, well, technically queen of both places by that point with her second husband. But anyway, what happened is Helena is named in the story, and she's made anachronistically the wife of King Alexander Jannaeus. So there's two ways to look at it. Either it's moving Jesus a previous century by also moving Helena also into the previous century, or it's moving Jannaeus a century forward. You could take it either direction. But it looks like this text was just a mess attempting to resolve it, and it just creates more. It ends up creating more problems than it solves. And then it kind of gets a little hilarious when it has Judas and Jesus fighting. They're both flying in the air like they're Superman versus Zod, and they're coming at each other.
But the question is, who attempted and put him to death? Jews or Romans or Gentiles,
right?
In general, because Edessa itself doesn't seem to be in the mind of the Sanhedrin statement. And this is one of the issues that I have,
right?
Because stoning somebody was a common practice of the Jews. Who is trying to put that Yeshua to death? Who is the main people targeting that Yeshua in the story? Is it consistent with what we see in this statement, as opposed to Jesus' own people rejected him first, handed him over to be hanged? The Jews hung people too, by the way. That's why they said, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." We even see this in the life of King David, who had a lot of people put to death that were associated with Saul. They were hung out in order to take the curse of God off of them, and they left them out to be eaten by crows, and a mother's out there fighting them off. So Jews hung people too. Stoning was the main form in Jesus's day of sorcery or any kind of seduction of schism that was going to lead people into heresy. And so I don't think the later first century and second century story fits the descriptor of the Sanhedrin. I won't say definitively that it is excluded. I just don't see how it is this more consistent than with the gospel narratives that we see here. Because another thing that was asked is that Jesus would have somebody speak on his behalf as innocent. And in the gospels we see nobody spoke up. Peter had an opportunity to defend himself and Jesus. He denied and ran off. Everybody else is sitting there listening to people bring false accusations. Nobody came to the defense of Jesus. Nobody. So it seems, again, consistent with the gospel accounts.
You know, that's interesting, because I was going to say this is late, and it could be dependent on, it's so late that, and it is kind of, well, for lack of a better word, funky, that I'm not sure. I would have said, let's not rest hard on this one. On the other hand, you bring up a good point, sir, about the stoning. That is something about this. I've seen this reference many times, and I'd never really considered it in the way you just did there. So you've given me food for new thought about this one for sure. But I think I agree with your general point that we shouldn't rest too hard, land too hard here on this Talmudic reference.
I agree. And again, in the gospel accounts, their first intuition was to stone Jesus on multiple occasions. And it got to a point where they couldn't accuse him enough in the Jewish law. They had to move it to Roman law. So I think that's interesting. Thallus, there's an interesting quote here. Again, this is debatable from Julius Africanus in fragment 18. He gets in the debate about the story in the Gospels where it goes dark in midday. And he references this not in positive about Thallus, but criticizing Thallus on the explanation. He says, this darkness Thallus in the third book of his history calls, by the way, we don't have this work anymore. What we do have is fragmented and is preserved by Africanus. Calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day according to the moon, and the passion of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover. But an eclipse of the sun takes place only when the moon comes under the sun. Now, he goes on later and continues this, and I'm going to bring in two points about this argument about this darkness that happened over the earth. He mentions this later about Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th to the 9th hour. So 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock p.m. Midday, the highest point of the sun in the brightest part of the day was completely dark. He's saying this isn't just like a gospel claim. We have others claiming this too. He gives you two names here. If that was some sort of independent claim, it's not, because we see later Origen against Celsus does the same exact thing and also references Phlegon. He mentions in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of the Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the results correspond to his predictions. He goes on later. And with this regard to the eclipse in the times of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place. So Origen is also corroborating. So Africanus is not independent on this individual as making the claim that something happened from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock during the day where complete darkness had hit. This eclipse took place. Now he's referencing two people, and Origen comes behind and says the same exact thing that Africanus says. They're both saying the same exact thing, referencing the same book. And in fact, one of these points, it's almost like Origen can't remember the exact location. He's like, it's in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of the Chronicles. So it's interesting how we go through this, and you have two statements now from Origen and Africanus that are affirming a statement about the darkness of Jesus on the cross from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, because they're all acknowledging some sort of eclipse had happened. And it's not just coming from Christian ideas. It's coming from individuals who are alive in the first century trying to explain away. Now, they're not saying this positively. They're actually arguing against their reasoning. They're not. Africanus is like, yeah, we're all in agreement. It happened because of this and because of Jesus. He's saying, how can you say that this happened and it wasn't connected to the resurrection or the death of Jesus on the cross and what happened from 12 to 3? Africanus is defending a Christian position against somebody who is not defending a Christian position. There's no positive reason for them to mention this if they're just making it up.
Again, this is pretty late, and this could be argued to be dependent. Even these guys and their sources could be argued to be dependent on Christian sources, even if they're giving a natural explanation, and even if they're aware of eclipses or an eclipse and earthquakes in the reign of Tiberius. Again, I'm not sure we should land hard on this, but it's interesting. But I have to.
Thallus wasn't a Christian, though.
It's interesting.
Right? Thallus wasn't a Christian, neither was Phlegon.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that doesn't preclude them from taking for granted a basic fact from Christian sources either. I think we have to bear in mind that this is late enough that they might simply assume an underlying fact that Christian sources are conveying to them.
Do you think they were tracking eclipses both in Jewish, Roman at that point, especially one that was in the midday? Do you think those were being recorded by the few scientists of their day, astrology? I mean, do you think that was a part of the discussions at that time, and they're trying to argue why it happened?
Yeah. See, I'm certain that official Roman government, I mean, they were regulated because, knowledge of the future was,
Sure.
important knowledge. We know, for example, that the Emperor Tiberius had an astrologer. We're even given his name, Thrasyllus. We
That's
know
true.
that Vespasian had an astrologer, official astrologer. They took portents in the sky very seriously.
Very much.
And you don't have to be a Zoroastrian. You could be a Roman in Rome in the first century and take events in the sky as having religious significance. In fact, they almost certainly regarded them as having religious significance of some kind, communicative significance.
I don't have the information right in front of me. I don't exactly remember some of the work that's been done on Thallus, because Thallus is the one here that interests me the most about this eclipse thing. So I think some people, some other scholars will say that the reference to Thallus, because Thallus is in the 8050s, but the source that's referring to it is late.
Well,
And
Africanus
okay,
is much later, of course.
yeah,
But
yeah.
again, he's
I
not
don't,
speaking. He's
like I said,
speaking
I
of a
don't exactly
source that's prior
remember.
to him,
Yeah,
which we don't have, unfortunately. What we do have is preserved in criticism of it, not in agreement, but in
I see.
criticism. So when Africanus is quoting Thallus, he's not like the dude's right. I mean, it's right here. He's actually arguing that Thallus's conclusions are wrong about this eclipse. Africanus is, of course, he's biased. He's assigning this phenomena, the eclipse, to the death of Jesus, and he gives the timeline. He's like, do you think it's a coincidence that the Jews celebrated Passover on the 14th day according to the moon, which just so happens to be a part of the passion of the Savior that falls on that very day? I mean, this is what Africanus is doing. He's like, Thallus is trying to tell us that there's nothing to this. It's just a natural phenomena. And he's like, no, it's not. For Christians, this is just too coincidental. He's criticizing Thallus. He's not praising him. But what we see is commonality, that something weird happened between 12 and 3 o'clock. And he later affirms this with another writer, and so does Origen. Another writer we don't have his writings of, that is also from an earlier source, stating that this eclipse was talked about for years, from Thallus to Phlegon, which is about almost 100 years. There's still debates about what happened on that day. And even he's recording that this happened during the time of Tiberius, which goes back to what Jim was talking about, because I think, did you just say that Tiberius, we know exactly who is in charge of recording a lot of these things? Tiberius was fascinated with this kind of stuff. So there's obviously a connectivity to record. The debate that was going on is how and why. What was the reason for this phenomena? Christians are touting the convenience of the very day that their Savior was killed and the hours the Gospels recorded it. These other individuals are not trying to argue against Christianity or for it. They're just recording things, and the Christians are mad that they're not tying it back to their Jesus. That's the issue here. So I don't see any reason to make this up. Even if it's later, they're referring to earlier sources that we just don't have anymore. Two people have now cited the same. So obviously we can argue that one of these is probably legit. There's no reason that both these guys will make it. Africanus and Origen don't seem to be making this up. I don't see any reason to be making this up.
Can you pull the Thallus quote back on the screen?
Sure.
Yeah. So, from this quote, I could see how someone could take a different angle from this and say, okay, let's concede. Let's concede real quick. Something strange happened. I see what you're saying, Stephen. So let's see we concede that something happened here. Something strange. It doesn't sound like it's being explicitly. I wonder if Thallus was explicit in our words that this event was connected to Jesus. Now I know the source that's quoting Thallus here is taking that interpretation, but I wonder if that's actually how Thallus took it.
It's fair. Fair point. Very, very fair point. I think that it's implied than directly stated because of his statement of the passion of our Savior falls on the day before Passover. I think that Thallus was criticizing Christians for this. And I think Africanus was fighting back. Because the way that, if you read the whole document, you read the whole fragment, and you even go to his, in the different sections, because under fragment 18, there's section 1, section 2, section 3, section 4, etc. If you read it, he's in, like, Africanus is in fight mode. I mean, he's angry. He's not positive about this. Again, this is an argument. He feels like he has to defend the account of Jesus from the Gospels. And so it is implied that Thallus was mad that Christians were trying to manipulate this eclipse to fit a narrative. And Africanus feels like he has to fight back against this idea. So it would be implied, it's not directly stated, I agree with you, it's not directly stated, but it would be implied that he was anti-Christian and their association of this eclipse. Almost if he's defending Claudius's, or specifically not Claudius, Tiberius's statement about these things, or the records about these things, where Thallus seems to be assuming, and maybe even Phlegon is assuming, that these Christians are trying to create a narrative out of nothing. And the Christians now feel like they got to argue back and say, wait, how can you say this is nothing? It's too convenient on the timeline. It's too convenient with the Jewish holiday and when Jesus was killed. So it's almost like they're saying, don't tie Jesus to this eclipse. Now, we don't know the whole argument. Maybe Thallus made an issue of like, you guys got the wrong year. You've got the wrong timeline. We don't know because we don't have that section. So maybe Africanus was biased here. Maybe he was manipulating Thallus's argument and going ad hom here. We don't really know. But at the end of the day, it is implied, Jacob, that Thallus was criticizing the association of this eclipse with Jesus, and Africanus had to go to defense of it. And then the same thing happens with Phlegon. We could be the case. I'm not saying it is, but it's something to add to the discussion. None of these things, most of these things that I'm presenting are here for discussion. That's why we're doing this episode, is to discuss it. Is it possible? Is it not? I'm not living or dying on Thallus or Phlegon or any of these others. I'm just saying that there is too much convenience of consistency with Roman record that acknowledges certain things in the gospel accounts. Do they prove everything? No, they don't prove everything. They seem to imply that a man existed and everybody's willing to concede he existed. And everybody's trying to associate, did this really happen with him? Was he a sorcerer? Was he a magician? Was he able to create climactic, crazy things like eclipses? It seems like everybody's debating about how special was the guy. How special really was the guy? From Tacitus to Josephus to him being a wise king by Serapion and his son. This is the part that we're all struggling with, is like, can we prove the gospel's right about what Jesus did and said? Not necessarily. Can we prove he existed the way the gospels say he did? That seems to be plausible and has far more reaching evidence than just one or two statements.
Yeah, I what I will say is I'm more impressed by the other evidence that has been presented tonight, and I've been familiar with that evidence for a while, as Jim also has been. When it comes to Thallus, I think, to conclude my thoughts on Thallus, it's kind of coming back to me now, because I remember looking into Thallus a long time ago. I wasn't too impressed by the way that some have tried to hand wave and totally dismiss Thallus. The other sources like Phlegon, I'm not as impressed with personally. When I look at Thallus, it's not clear to me. So something strange happened. I could see that something strange happened, but I question if Thallus associated with Jesus originally.
It's fair.
I feel like that interpretation of it's what's late. That it was, okay, this happens to parallel something similar that was described in the Gospels. Therefore, okay, that must be connected to Jesus, whatever that weird event was. And that's the thing that I have a problem with. So I don't personally think that point there is particularly strong, but that's just my take.
Well, the only question is, what would motivate both Origen and Africanus to come out and criticize it? There's a reason. They didn't just pick a random person to fight. They picked people who made claims against Christian, because at their point, Africanus, Origen, even Justin the Martyr, at this point, Christians were on the defense, including the Epistle to Diognetus in the mid to late 2nd century. It seems like they're having to defend their positions, and they're having to pull all the sources and evidence to do it. Something motivated Africanus to pick on Thallus on this subject of the 12 to 3 o'clock disposition of Jesus on the cross. Thallus must have said something to really piss him off. for him to even mention it. And I'm not saying it proves it. I'm not arguing with that point, Jacob. I'm saying something Thallus said motivated Africanus to go into defense, bring Phlegon and others into it, saying there's all these people acknowledging what we acknowledge, but they refuse to give credit to Jesus of Nazareth. That's Africanus's disposition. Something ignited this response from him to pick out these two stories, and Origen picks out one of those same stories to argue the point of Christianity being right all along. So something had to do that. We don't know, and I'm assuming, and I'm trying to connect dots of like, well, it makes sense indirectly that Thallus said something critical that made Christians go on the defense, because that's the position that Africanus is in when he's responding.
Yeah, I wish we had more.
Me too.
I wish we had, exactly, the full context here from everyone. And I wish we had some kind of corroboration also of the event from some other, in some other way. But one thing that I think you are right about, Dr. Boyce, the argument is not about the existence of Jesus. Whether they're taking a negative or a positive stance, they agree he existed.
Yeah.
It's not as though someone said, oh, wait a minute here. As they were saying back in the first century, this was all made up. That you don't see.
Yeah, it's kind of assumed common knowledge. I mean, we've implied so much of our modern debate about Jesus on these people. It would be absurd for them to have any disposition that goes, who? Jesus of Nazareth? Who's this guy? It seems like the Romans and the Jews are very familiar with him because of the reputation of his teachings that is spread, because as they said, the Gospels and the teaching of these Gospels and the doctrine of Jesus has made it even into Rome, which once it hits Rome, all roads lead to Rome, right? It spreads really, really quick. And it wasn't going away. As Josephus said, it won't go extinct. Right. Here's another person that dealt with it, Pliny the Younger. In his letter, book 10, letter 96, he said, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in the alternative verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, or this Christus, this Messiah figure that they gave the name to. Christians came from his name, little Christ, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which, with their custom to separate, and they're reassembled to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So he's talking about these Christians. He's trying to figure them out. Remember, they're wondering if the Christians are conspirators. He even talks about these women deaconesses that were distributing food to poor, and they had arrested them and questioned them. They're concerned, why would humans who are part of this cultic belief where they worship this guy like a god, they sing to him like a god, come and meet on certain days before the sun comes up? What maniac would do that? I mean, that's his perspective. The one thing that they were concerned was happening was that there were conspirators. We don't see this but till later through Hegesippus, who's one of the church historians. He talks about Domitian. Domitian, at the end of the first century, starts investigating Christianity. He's concerned that they're going to overtake, or they're conspirators, and they're trying to overthrow the Roman government. And they keep hearing that this king, this David figure, Jesus, is going to come back and overthrow Rome. So according to Hegesippus, he sends out an investigation to find bloodline members of Jesus. And in doing it, he finds Jesus's brother Jude's two grandsons. They're still alive. He has them hauled up. He investigates them. He asks them, is their relative a threat to Rome? The account goes, they show him callous hands and their tax records. And they basically, we're just farmers. We pay our taxes. His kingdom is not of this world. And Domitian thought they were just lunatics that needed just to be left alone, because Domitian didn't want to become a Nero. Trajan did not want to become a Nero. These guys did not want to be accused of the insanity that Nero was accused of. So they were being more cautious. Now they dealt with it. Yes, there was miniature persecutions that came from it, and even put to death Christians at that point, especially Trajan. So Christians were still being put to death, but not at the same length that they were doing it under Nero. But they were concerned. These guys are conspirators. They're meeting in weird meetings. They don't let outsiders in. It's ironic how Christianity today, it's like, everybody come to church. That is not the way it was at the end of the first century. In the second, it was, you're not a Christian. You're not allowed around our group because you were a threat. It was a possibility, which made them sound secretive. They're meeting at weird hours. They're meeting before the sun came up, which was consistent with the resurrection, on certain days. And they're singing hymns to this Christus like he's a god. So again, and then he's like, they're making weird oaths, like, don't cheat on your spouses, don't lie, don't steal money, don't deny your beliefs. So Pliny is very critical of Christians as well, but he's also saying, he's trying to figure out, like, what the hell do we do with these people? I mean, like, that's his disposition. Like, we don't know what to do with them. And he even arrested them and wrote back for us, what should I do with these people? Am I doing the right thing? So here's another person that's instrumental in bringing up Christ as well, and that he is worshipped as a god.
Well, as I say earlier, I think this is more an attestation to the Christian movement than it is to the particulars of a human being.
Sure.
It lacks a good deal. I mean, it lacks any real biographical detail on Jesus. On the other hand, it does attest to the fact that there are Christians. Now, between the time of Nero and Hadrian, there's good reason for the Roman government to be suspicious of Jewish messianic cults. We are talking about the period of the Jewish wars. And Josephus and Tacitus, for example, tell us that it is the messianic prophecies that motivated that Jewish war. So it would seem to me that what Pliny and Trajan are trying to get to the bottom of here is, are these guys dangerous Jewish rebels, like your ordinary Jewish messianic of the period probably was, whether they were followers of Kokba or zealots in the First War. So what they've got on their hands is the business of sorting through who's dangerous and who's not. And so Pliny tells the emperor his procedure. If they're willing to say prayers in front of it, our images, our state images, then they seem cool to me, and I let them go. Is that the correct procedure, boss? And Trajan says, yeah, you're doing it the correct way here. Because what it seems to me that particularly in the period right between the two great wars, the First Jewish War and the Bar-Kokhba Rebellion, what Roman emperors are very keen on doing is distinguishing between Messianic Jews who would be violent rebels and Messianic Jews who were harmless in terms of their loyalty to the state. Now, we have some good evidence that there were lots of Christians in the Roman army by the end of the second century. Indeed, we're getting some good archaeological evidence that at the beginning of the third century, we have the, Jesus is God inscription that was just recently found in association with a Roman military site, which is very fascinating. And it does seem to corroborate that we do have Christians in the Roman army. And if there were Christians in the Roman army, they would be able to have passed Pliny's test. They would have to be inducted into the Roman army at the time. So I think we do have a variety of Christians, and indeed a wide variety of Christians in the second century. And what Trajan and Pliny is basically attesting, as I say, to the movement, not so much the man. But on the other hand, it is of keen interest to the Romans at this time to be able to distinguish between, let's call them safe Jewish messianics versus rebel Jewish messianics. Between the two Jewish wars, I think that is of the imperative security concern of the Roman government in the context of people who are following a claimed Jewish Messiah. Are they like Bar Kokhba, and they're going to go to the mat and fight us, and give us a hell of a time as they do in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, or are they willing to submit to our images? And this suggests that there are a variety of Christians, that the Christian movement, as Pliny sees it, has these moral beliefs and this as you point out, this odd pre-dawn practice. So that's his understanding of what a Christian is, what he's calling a Christian, at least, to sort of just, again, to try and sort through what type of messianics these guys are, as opposed to, say, the violent ones who were zealots in the First War and followers of Bar Kokhba in the Second Great Jewish Rebellion.
But he does associate them the same way that Tacitus does to this Christus character, that their name is derived from a person.
From a person, at least, with that title, Messiah. And that, I think, is the concern, is indeed that title. I mean, we're told by Suetonius that there were disturbances that led to the expulsion of the Jews in the reign of Claudius after the crucifixion that were led by
I've got the quote right
Creston.
here.
Now that's an interesting. The Suetonius reference is interesting because if it's a contemporary, that is to say, if that guy was around in 49-50 AD, it's not the Jesus who was crucified some years earlier, and he's apparently a violent messianic, the very sort of messianics that the Romans are keen to uncover because they are a security threat to the empire. They are involved in seditious activity outright. In fact, that's what's interesting about Tacitus's reference. What makes these Jewish messianics a good scapegoat, or perhaps even the good perp for the Great Fire of '64? They're violent rebels. They're not like the pacifists that we read about in the Gospels, or even pro-Roman, like we read about from Paul in Romans 13. So our New Testament Christians are going out of their way to say, we're not a threat. We're peaceful, we're pro-Roman, we pay our taxes. Don't confuse us with those violent Jewish messianics. And but that seems to be a kind of a theme that springs out from Tacitus, Pliny's correspondence, and Pliny's correspondence, very, very interestingly, is saying, well, here's a test we've got so we can sort out the safe ones from the not safe ones, because apparently there's a variety of Jewish messianic cults, and we need to sort through which of these people are safe to the empire and who represent a danger to the empire, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But I, no doubt with Tacitus, who associates it back to the person who was killed by Pontius Pilate.
Yeah.
He and Pliny, the correspondence going back and forth between Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, all around that similar line of era, are working under different circumstances, trying to figure out these groups, because they all talk about these different groups, these different sects. So if Tacitus believes the Christians are after this Christus that goes back to the Pontius Pilate execution, I would believe that Pliny does too. I don't know if they would just be later people. Now, Suetonius is an interesting figure that you brought up as well. I brought the quote here as well. In the life of Claudius, 25:4, because of the Jews at Rome caused constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus, Claudius, expelled them from the city of Rome. I'm pretty sure that was a reference you had a minute ago as well. So these are good things. And Jacob, I'm going to take the screen off if you want to bring us back to life. But anyway, these are interesting perspectives and discussions to have. These are the alleged claims. I brought what was alleged. I'm not even saying I agree with all of them. Suetonius, for example, to me is more of the questionable ones. Some of these others are worth thinking about, like Thallus and others. I wouldn't hold my anchor on those. First of all, I accept, we're going without Paul, but I accept Paul. I accept the four Gospels, naturally. As a Christian, most Christians would. But I also think that it is overly corroborated, and I don't even know why we have these debates. To me, it's that obvious. From Josephus to Tacitus to Pliny, I think we have a case for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified under Pontius Pilate and was alleged, whether it's believed or not, was alleged to have risen from the dead. So, and it created a movement that spread all over the entire Roman Empire. So I see this as plausible. I think it's good. We haven't even mentioned Galatians. We haven't talked about 1 Corinthians 15 tonight. Here we are. I think we have enough content outside of the New Testament. We didn't even talk about the Gospels and their sources and the independent statements in each one of them. We didn't even get to any of that. We're just talking about Roman historians, Roman court historians, Jewish historians, random Syrian people and connections outside of the Christian world, and then church fathers in Egypt. So that's what we dealt with mostly today. And I think just from these alone, we have enough cause to accept a Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, who was allegedly killed and then raised from the dead.
Well, that's a fascinating presentation you made. Thank you very much. I have to say that of the evidence that you presented, I think that our best bets are Tacitus, Pliny the Younger's correspondence with Trajan, and Josephus. If we're stepping outside of Christian literature, if we're stepping outside into sources that we have that are either written for a general audience like Josephus, or actually pagan Romans that aren't even Jewish like Pliny the Younger and Tacitus, and it would be hard for me to understand their references if there wasn't a movement started by a Jesus who was known certainly by that, at least by that time, as the Christ or Christ. It is simply hard to explain. I think we're safe in saying, just from those three sources, that there was almost certainly a Jesus who was crucified and believed to have been resurrected. And so, otherwise it just wouldn't make sense. And the Christian literature itself that we have, along with these later sources, frankly indicate to me that we're looking at a variety of, quote, Christians with different perspectives already. And that in itself would be hard to explain if there weren't an original movement that was started by followers of a person named Jesus. I think it's far more like that. One of the things that bothers me about mythicism is that they have to do a lot of work to say how an angelic figure evolved into, there is Jewish literature and there's Philo and stuff, and you can construct an argument like Carrier does, I suppose. But it seems to me that's far more strained an explanation, far less likely than simply saying, "Oh, look, there was a Jesus who was crucified under Pilate. Some of his earlier followers had visions of the risen Jesus." And when we add Paul in, Paul makes that quite explicit. Look, I, as one born out of time, had such a vision, but I can tell you, James did, Cephas did, these 500 did. And so it would be hard for me when we plug Paul back into the picture. It really makes it now hard for me to, and Paul's argument in Galatians with other Christians, with other members at least of what we could call a Jesus movement, if there's this argument over Torah orthodoxy in Galatians, wait a minute here. We have a movement of Jesus followers arguing with one another. And that really suggests to me both that we have different sects of Christians from reasonably early on, and that there was a historical Jesus who inspired that variety of sects.
It's fair points.
I'd like to take a couple of super chat questions before we close. We have 2 super chats. Solera Knight, thank you for your super chat. How would an archaeologist establish a historical Jesus using the scientific method outside the fabled Gospels? Is this even possible? Well, I think
if you're not a Roman emperor or a Roman governor or something, that leaving an inscription. If you're a Roman official, then we've got inscriptions, and we can say so and so was the ideal of Corinth, for example, Erastus or something, and we could have an inscription that tells us there was such a person at the time. Or the Roman emperor, we have actually physical evidence, inscriptions on buildings perhaps that are attributed to him, coins with their image on it. But apart from people that important, it's very hard from the archaeological record. We were talking 2,000 years ago. How do you corroborate anyone's existence apart from texts that we have? We're in nearly every case, when they mention a person, we're reliant on ancient texts to corroborate their existence. And if it seems plausible, and unless there's a reason not to believe or to believe that we're being misled directly, our ancient sources will, like Tacitus or Josephus, whom we mentioned, they'll make up speeches for some Roman general. They'll make up speeches for some important Jewish zealot leader. But the existence of that zealot leader or that existence of that Roman general, I think, is something we've got to assume is true, because why would they then elaborate a speech for that person or elaborate a position for that person? So while their standards of history were inferior to our standards for doing history or journalism today, nonetheless are only evidence for ancient figures apart from coins and inscriptions, when we're lucky to have coins and inscriptions. Now, in the case of Jesus, I know there's just debate going on about the Talpiot tomb, for example. If that were to be proven through physical evidence with real solidity, and unfortunately, the James ossuary was removed from its original context. But look, if we, it's a lucky thing when we get inscription evidence at all for ancient figures. So we are largely reliant on ancient texts, even when those ancient texts don't come up to contemporary journalistic or historical standards.
Especially if that figure was only on the scene for 3 years. Most of the time we get inscriptions, images, or things like that, it's for somebody who did something significant for a long period of time, war heroes, kings, emperors. The problem is that Jesus was in a bad situation. What he did was rejected by his own people. So he obviously wasn't popular with those who had the money. And I mean, his appeal was support people. So they're not going to make an image of him. They killed him. So if there even was an image of him, they're tearing it down because his ministry enough was chaotic for the Jewish people, afraid to lose their temple. You think they're going to let him put up a statue, their beloved Messiah? Not a chance. The Romans went along with it to kill any kind of disruption and chaos that comes from conspirators or something like the Zealots. So they silenced it to shut everybody up. So they're not going to make an image to the guy. So what we are relying on is text. I mean, the same could be said of more figures than Jesus. There's people that believe Socrates was a myth because all that we have of him is his disciples' statements. There's not much about him. And then they put him to death. So we have to ask,
why would they? What are Xenophon and Plato making such a big deal over this guy Socrates about if there weren't a Socrates?
Right.
So I think it's a safe inference to say that there was a Socrates. Or say take a Roman general that Tacitus mentions, Corbulo, from the mid-first century. Do we have any? I don't know of. There may be, and I'm just going out on a limb here. But even if there is no inscription or physical evidence of the general Corbulo, who was operating legions for the Romans in the Eastern Mediterranean, the eastern part of their empire, I would still be confident, reasonably confident, that General Corbulo existed. We're told of his deeds, his battles. We're told of things he said by Tacitus. And so it's a safe inference that, if a Roman historian is talking about him, within the century of his life, that this dude existed.
Well, and here's another thing too we have to keep in mind, because we want archaeological discoveries, and there were non-archaeological discoveries for a lot of figures that just didn't happen until the last 50 to 100 years. Right. It didn't mean they're not true. Right. We were depending on historical attestation for multiple things in history, that archaeology was 1900 years and 1800 years late catching up to the historical attestation. So maybe that's the case. I mean, even Peter, for example, they just recently in Galilee found an inscription to Peter and Andrew, where the Bible alleged was their hometown. That wasn't around for the longest time. And then they even found Greek inscriptions, which indicated that they were Greek-speaking Christians in Galilee, which makes sense with the trade language. So, I mean, but these inscriptions didn't come about to the last few hundred years. A lot of these ideas of these texts that were talked about, or even these interpretations of the Hebrew text, they went missing for a long period of time until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 1940s. Same thing about these texts about the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Truth and the Gospel of Mary. We didn't know any of that stuff existed until they were taken out in Nag Hammadi, right? I mean, now all of a sudden, we have all these texts that all these people are talking about that at some point people were wondering if they even existed at all. So things come just because we don't have something now, but again, what is the likelihood of something of Jesus, a 3-year ministry that did these radical things that were against both the Jewish and the Roman support? Why would there be statues, inscriptions? But yet, even then, there are inscriptions. And then you got the whole debate about, which is, I'm completely neutral on this one at this point, but even looking at the Shroud of Turin, there's a whole lot of fun discussion on that with well, this was later. Well, we've reevaluated. Oh, now these scientists have changed their minds about it. So again, there's work to be done. There will always be work to be done, but there's enough historical attestation for us not to need to deny this.
We are so lucky. I mean, in the middle of the 20th century, we made 2 such important finds as the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library. And so as time goes on, we recover more textual evidence, we recover more inscription evidence, and let us hope that that process continues and we continue to find evidence so that we can understand better and better the ancient world. Yeah.
Solar Knight, thank you for another super chat. The Jesus character a composite of Hebrew gurus from pamphlets that later got grafted into a charismatic, popular, expanding cult. Roman Mithraism evolved into Christianity.
Well, the problem with that is that Mithraism, if I'm not mistaken, was a male-only cult. That doesn't fit the ministry of Jesus at all. In fact, he was one of the few people that were actually involving women in that society, which was not normal. And if I'm not mistaken, the Mithric savior idea theme post Christian. And to my knowledge, there's nothing that shows any evidence of Christianity borrowing from that. Now, you both might know that better than I do, but from the memory I have, it was a male only, and I'm pretty sure it was secretive. Jesus wasn't secretive. He was very public. He also included women in his ministry. That's the ones that were at his cross, that were at his tomb. He was casting demons out of them. He was forgiving them of their sins, like the woman in adultery. He was like Mary Magdalene had 7 demons. I mean, she starts following him. You have all these women that are supporting, like Joanna, financially his ministry. That doesn't fit anything in Mithraism, if I'm correct. And it's post-Christian in documentation. There's no evidence that it borrows. Jim, I might be wrong, guys. I mean, you guys tell me if I'm wrong.
Mithraism was, as I understand it, an exclusively male thing, which limited its spread. One of the powerful elements of Christianity was its openness to everybody. There were pagan cults that women could and did participate in. Mithraism was not one of them.
Not one, yeah.
But I will say this. I will say that if the Christianity or even the portraits of Jesus take on parallels, to use the fraught term, parallels with other suffering, martyred, semi-divine beings and their cults, let me suggest that that was layered into the movement of Jesus later on from Jesus. It doesn't tell me that there wasn't a historical Jesus. What it tells me is that there could be elements from other religions that were remarkably similar, in my view, to Christianity. Take, for example, Serapis. Here you've got a syncretistic god created with the Ptolemies. He became the god, Ptolemy the First sort of made the god of Alexandria. He's a combination of Osiris and Apollo and Asclepius. He's a healer god. He resurrects. Because he's identified with Hades. He's an afterworld god. And so you may say to yourself, well, like Asclepius, he was born of a mortal woman and a divine man. He healed and resurrected like Asclepius did. He's one of the elements that comes into the syncretism that is Serapis. Vespasian himself performs healing miracles at the temple of the Serapeum in Alexandria. So we know him to be a healing god. We know him to be a resurrection god, taking on the features, say, of Osiris, Hades, Asclepius, and so forth, as well as Apollo. Tacitus has a very interesting, of course, Plutarch does too, have fascinating descriptions of that deity. So the fact that Jesus's cult is not unlike, say, the cult of Serapis, doesn't tell me that there wasn't a historical Jesus at all. It tells me about religious norms of the period, if that makes sense.
No, I would agree and echo that. And somebody pointed out in the audience, I thought it was a good Captain Lurk even talked about how Christianity particularly focused on the lame, the maimed, the poor. That was not the case in our counterpart. They were focusing primarily on the upper and strong. I think there were soldiers in a lot of ways. A lot of these were warriors.
The
So
Mithridatic cult was very much
yeah,
popular in the
yeah.
army. Probably
I,
more
I don't.
Christianity early on. Yeah.
I just don't see the parallels. I don't see them.
But what we do see is a remarkable thing. The Roman Empire, by creating a multinational empire, is, as Pliny says, and Tacitus says, what we're going to see is we're going to see foreign cults coming to Rome.
Yeah,
And
which is what happened.
And that's exactly what we're seeing. Rome is roads lead to Rome, as you referred to earlier. What we're seeing is the Romans officially adopt Greek religion. They're in Virgil in the Aeneid is officially using Greek religion to legitimize the first dynasty of Roman emperors. They're using Vespasian just to indicate he goes to the Serapeum and he does healing mirror. He's integrating Egyptian religion into his own legitimacy. That's what Romans did. Romans are not beating away and performing a genocide on these religions. They're trying to integrate them. They're trying to soften them. They're trying to incorporate them, if you will. We have side-by-side inscriptions across the Roman Empire with local deities and Roman deities. Roman flexibility and comparative tolerance. Now, in many ways, the Romans were obviously a brutal empire. 2,000 years ago was a brutal time. But what we see for Rome in Roman political strategy is to, as you pointed out earlier, when you read Pliny's correspondence, what you're looking at here are people who are trying their best to sort through the safe ones and the dangerous ones, to live with it if they can, and in some cases, to incorporate it within their own state religions or imperial cults.
And that was a big part, specifically in Athens, if anybody accepts Acts, Paul gets to Mars Hill and he sees all these inscriptions everywhere to every god you could possibly think of. And just in case they missed one, they put an unknown god inscription, right? And so Paul took a moment to share his belief about who believed that unknown god was. But this idea, like you said, these inscriptions all over the Greek and Roman Empire, working in the East and the West, they were not against other cultic religions or other beliefs in different deities. In fact, they felt safer if we accepted everyone. The reason Christianity became problematic is they didn't think they needed to be sanctioned to do what they were doing. And a lot of them refused to acknowledge the other gods that were there. They only believed in the one true God. That's why they were called atheists. And this is one of the biggest criticisms that came to Christianity, is because all the other pagan religions were willing to come to Rome or in parts of Greece and areas like that and say, sure, yeah, I mean, we're fine with these other people worshiping their gods, and here's ours while we're at it. Christians are like, nope, they're all false. Every one of them's there. Every one of them is a fake God. There's only one true living God. Let me tell you about him. That's why Christians got the bad rep all the time, because they were the ones that came in and refused to be universalists with the gods. And so, and this is one of the biggest arguments we see in this epistle to Diognetus, some sort of governor, some sort of leader in Rome. And one of the things that was made is that you guys serve all these other gods and we think it's dumb. Like, I mean, he's defending monotheism in that letter, and why polytheism is irrational. And he talks about how it's even logically stupid to adhere to a god made out of stone and wood and so forth. So this was the big contention at the time that's consistent with what we see even in the New Testament, of where Christians stood in the Roman Empire with polytheism and opposed to their monotheism. So it was a big ordeal. And to me, it points to the things that we've already said multiple times.
We do see a trend toward philosophy, just in philosophy. For example, Neoplatonists, take Plotinus, he's talking about the one, and very famously. So we're seeing a philosophical movement in the direction of monotheism, without a doubt, all on its own, even simply in developing Greek philosophy within the Roman world. I think that's another thing that makes Christianity attractive. By the time of Constantine, they're looking for a religion to unify
Yes.
their ethnic and religiously disparate empire, and
Which he did.
There's some indication that Saul Invictus, the other main religion at the time of Constantine, was a monotheistic kind of thing, but their understanding of Neoplatonic philosophy was leading them to, for unphilosophic grounds, to monotheism. Plotinus is the one, for example, and we see that influencing and meshing with early Christianity. By the time of, say, Augustine of Hippo, he's definitely meshing Neoplatonic thought and Christianity as being a totally integrated sort of perspective. Augustine famously tells us about his own life, how he had been a Neoplatonic.
Yes, he was.
And by the time he's a Christian, he can actually bring that to bear and integrate it with Christian thought in a systematic way. Which
I think is a good thing, by the way. And then Thomas Aquinas later takes that and builds on it even more. He was definitely he was more Aristotelian, but at the end of the day, I mean, I think that what that shows that Christianity was open to philosophical ideas. They weren't totally against them. It just took time for that to be accepted because of the skepticism as it related to the teachings that they had. But what it came to realize is that there are elements. I think we actually see this later in John's gospel, that there are elements of the philosophical teaching that are compatible with Christianity. That's why he introduces the Logos in John 1:1. These are philosophical ideas. This is something that comes from that time period. So I thought it was good that Christianity was seeing that truth is taught outside of Christianity, and that sometimes these truths being taught through other wisdom or other philosophical ideas are compatible with Christianity. And that's what Augustine came to realize. And he really bridged the gap there. It's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
I'm going to take this super chat real quick and then we'll close. Solar Knight, thank you for your super chat. Our Father in heaven, Lord's Prayer makes us all sons and daughters of God.
I'm assuming because it starts with our Father who art in heaven. I would say that Jesus was teaching certain people that prayer, and specifically he was teaching his disciples how to pray. They asked, teach us to pray as John the Baptist taught his disciples to pray. And Jesus was speaking inclusively to his followers. I don't think that verse proves that all humanity are sons and daughters of God. All humanity are image bearers of God. In that sense, yes, sons and daughters. But the prayer itself, I think, is explicitly speaking to Jesus' followers.
All right, so we'll close here. I just want to thank everybody for watching the stream tonight. And Solar Knight, thank you for your super chats. And I'll add a link to Jim and Steven's respective materials in the description below in the pinned comment. And that being said, James and Steven, thank you both for joining me tonight.
Well, thank you for the fascinating conversation.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.